Today, I'm thrilled to share an episode filmed with Nabig, my beloved friend. We filmed this while on vacation in our villa. You'll still hear a little bit of construction noise in the background despite our best efforts, but I think it's a good episode to share nonetheless. Nabig is an American. He is the eldest son of a family of refugees fleeing religious persecution from Pakistan. He's the first in his family to get a college degree, where he graduated from Harvard. I actually caught him his summer after he graduated from business school, also from Harvard, and asked him all about his new role as the director of Climate Adaptation Strategy at a nonprofit, while also balancing pursuing a PhD at Berkeley. In this interview, we talk about what climate means to him.
I think climate offers this really cool, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rebuild the very foundations of our civilization.
The sort of dilemmas that surround his work.
Should they build a seawall, or should they just relocate people who live there? Because no amount of seawall is going to do any good.
And why all organizations should bake climate adaptation into their near future plans.
If you stopped polluting today, any carbon, say every factory shut down, every car that drove with oil was suddenly banned, there was no more carbon going into the atmosphere, you would still have the earth warm for another couple decades, because so much carbon has accumulated in the atmosphere that takes such a long time to break down that even if we stop today, climate change will continue because the earth also lags in its response back.
What does climate mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And I think there's so many components to this. What would be maybe most helpful is to talk about two. So maybe one that's much more broad, and then one that's way more personal to me. So I think starting off from the very sort of broad perspective about climate, Spencer Glendon at Probable Futures once said a phrase about climate, which I think has continued to stick with me and define how I think about the space. And he said, climate is a civilization problem. I think when you really think about what that means, it's basically this very existential understanding that at the heart of our civilization and society as we know it today is climate. It is what has allowed us to develop the way you have. It's what has allowed these institutions to thrive. It's what's allowed people to continue to live and build lives in the places that they do. And so climate is really this idea at a really broad scale of people being able to continue to live. It's the ability for animals and plants to continue to be healthy and survive. It's the ability for people who have lived in homelands for generations to continue to reside there and live productive lives. And it's the ability for us to really redefine what it means to live sustainably. And so when I think about climate, I really think about this really essential question of survival, of what it means to continue on planet Earth, knowing that it's changing rapidly. On a more personal level, I think climate is really, for me, connected to the idea of love of nature. And this goes way back to my time growing up in Missouri. So I grew up in the Ozarks, which is this plateau in southern Missouri, right smack dab in the center of the United States. And I spent a lot of time outdoors. I think really formative parts of my years were spent sort of experiencing different seasons, catching fireflies in the summertime, and watching huge storms roll by, and just really seeing the expanse of the sky and nature for all it had to offer. I think within that sort of element, I really think about how nature is this place that provides a lot of wonder and a lot of time for reflection and solace in a way that so many other parts of our society today don't. And so it was actually in college, when I went on a hiking trip in Wyoming, that in this sort of very naturey landscape where I was hiking for 3 weeks, that I sort of came to the conclusion that I was gay. And I think there's few places that I think would have provided me with that sort of space to arrive at that conclusion. I think there's elements of nature that sort of give us the space to not only step away from these lives, from these pressures, from these everyday things that impact us, and to really just be by ourselves and to be in this greater sort of world and really think about who we are, why we're there, and what sort of meaning we want to find. Recently, I went to Hong Kong, and I was sort of a newcomer to Hong Kong. I haven't been before, and I was actually just completely blown away by the amount of hiking that's there and really crazy views. You have these massive mountains that are covered with forests that you climb to the top, and then you look out and there's just this mega metropolis just laying down at the bay. And so I think for me, I just really enjoyed that sort of juxtaposition between the two of this massive city, but at the same time, this immense nature and mountains surrounding it. And for me, I think both this broad element of climate is civilization, it's about the continuation of humans and human society, and also this love of nature really drove sort of a lot of decisions and why I ended up working in climate today. And so after working a few years after college at a few tech firms and tech startups, I sort of decided that there wasn't anything else that would give me as much meaning as being able to work on this cause. And so that's sort of what led to the pivot. That's sort of been a really big driving force for me today.
What was it like going through business school as someone who is so focused on climate change?
I think business school was a decision I grappled with for a really long time. I think really deciding whether I wanted to go and whether, I think similar to what you were saying, whether it made sense for me to really go. I think at the heart of it was really this realization that, and maybe this is a very sort of American context thing, but businesses and markets sort of drive a lot of the world. They drive what sort of technology comes out. They drive what sort of changes happen. They drive culture. They drive systems. They drive politics. And when I was thinking about everything that was happening on Earth, this climate crisis, all these innovations that scientists were making and other people working in the climate space, I really thought about how there was no faster and more effective way to catalyze and transform our society at this point in time than I think through business. And so I think that was sort of the realization there is I had all this scientific understanding about climate and the Earth and what I think our society could really benefit from, but I didn't really know how to make sure it scaled. I didn't know how to make sure that I could actually do the transformations necessary for that to happen. And so I think that part really drove my sort of desire to go to business school. I think beyond that, it was also post-COVID. I think I was feeling sort of restless for a little bit of change. And I think I was also feeling a desire for personal development. And so I think those two sort of coincided again together of wanting to both learn this thing from a very academic lens of business, but then also wanting to do something different that also pushed me outside of my comfort zone.
So I was going through your background and I noticed that you spent the summer in between business school in London. You worked at Sightline Climate and Climate X. And so I'm curious, since clearly you spent most of your time growing up in the US, and one can argue that a lot of things are happening and moving on the ground in both California and New York City, in the US in general. So why London?
Yeah. Who doesn't love a summer abroad?
I know. So that's the answer. We're moving on.
As much as I love the US, it's a place I've grown up. It's a place where my community is. It's a place where I want to center my work. I think there are a lot of issues with the US. I think it hasn't actually kept up, really disappointingly, with a lot of climate action that needs to take place at a state or at a sort of country level. And so I think I was sort of itching for a chance to understand how other parts of the world were approaching it. Because again, climate isn't just going to affect one place. It affects everyone. It affects every single country around the world. And Europe is this really interesting sort of continent right now where they have actually passed a lot of really forward-looking climate regulations, climate standards, and climate action in general in a way that I think a lot of the other parts of the world hasn't or haven't actually focused that much about. And so part of me just wanted to understand what it was like to work in an environment where actually the regulations and the environment, almost the rules of the game, were completely different. Where actually there was not only political motivation and political pressure to do climate and to pursue things that supported climate, but there was also people action and tech and innovation that was happening that was driving that forward. And so that was sort of my idea with the sort of London summer, was really being able to have this chance to spend that time immersed in a different environment and sort of understand what I could and maybe what lessons I could actually bring back to the US, where hopefully the US will get to the same place Europe is either very soon or in a few years.
I would love for you to explain what your PhD is on.
Yes, I would also love to understand what my PhD is on. So the PhD is something that I think, again, and I think anyone who's pursued a PhD sort of knows this, it's this really nebulous journey to try to become a researcher, to try to become someone who is an expert at a very precise point of academic history and to be able to push a field along, basically to push the expanse of human knowledge along. And so for me, what that point has really focused on is, of course, climate. That's something that's core to what I study and do, but really to understand how climate and climate adaptation in particular, so climate adaptation being the way that we sort of adjust or build resilience to climate change, how tech and data science in particular, can drive forward how we pursue climate adaptation solutions. So what that sort of involves is really thinking about how can we design data products and technologies that can make sure that cities or governments or organizations know how to track climate adaptation, or what sort of climate adaptation actions to even take. Should they build a seawall, or should they just relocate people who live there, because no amount of seawall is going to do any good? And so it's a very sort of technical space, and I think one that hasn't gotten as much attention as it should. And so that's been a really big driver for me, is hopefully contributing to some understanding of the sort of synergies that can occur at the intersection of both.
What is one thing that you would want our peers to know about climate adaptation that you don't think they know?
I don't think you need to be an expert by any means. I don't think you need to dive into all of the science, or if it's really overwhelming, even understand all the intricacies. But I think you do need to understand a base level foundation, because businesses will need to adapt. The way you interact with people will change. The types of things that you talk about will change. The way your political systems might run will change. And so if you don't have an understanding of what climate is and what it means to you and how it might impact you, I think it's going to really rapidly become the case where it's just a part of everyday life. I think, maybe to put it really poetically, the big purpose with trying to understand climate and climate adaptation is the idea, and this also comes from someone at Probable Futures, Allison Smart, is really this idea of increasing the chances that our future is good. And again, it connects back to this idea of society and civilization. But I think one thing that I would really love people to sort of understand is that I think for a long time, I don't think you needed to know about climate. I think we lived in a really stable time period being hundreds of years, where our climate was relatively stable. We were able to build societies where people lived in the same place. They didn't need to move often because of sea levels changing rapidly or agricultural trends moving to different parts of the region. I think we were able to really settle down. I think we were able to build institutions. We were able to build culture. We were able to build entire expanses of human civilization. And I don't think you really need to know climate. I think you sort of knew what the weather was like on a seasonal basis, and you could sort of infer what happened, and that was enough for people. But I think that's all changed. I think given that the stability that we've sort of relied on with our climate has started to change so rapidly, the ways in which we've assumed that the future may no longer be what sort of Earth has naturally followed for so long, means that everyone is going to get impacted by climate.
So say a listener is hearing that answer that you just gave, which sounds very alarming, even just listening to it right now as a host, and they're like, okay, I'm on my phone. What would you say I look up right now? Is there a resource or a book?
I think I would say Probable Futures. I think they're an incredible climate literacy source that sort of walks you through the basics in a way that's really understandable about what you need to know about climate change, what it means for you, and really told from a perspective of stories, but with a really rigorous scientific foundation. So I would say start there.
Sounds good. And I also want to ask, given the state of how news is broadcasted, climate change is now very boring as a topic. It's very overwhelming. And the way to capture people's attention nowadays is, in the current news cycle, is to continuously bombard with like even more extremities, like this city will be underground or underwater in 50 years or whatnot. And I think as just a casual person who doesn't really understand much about climate, it can feel very exhausting and feel too overwhelming to even open up that page. And so I'm curious, as someone who very much has dedicated his life to digging deep into the data sets, looking at this and interpreting this data for people to understand, for the masses to understand, what keeps you optimistic? What keeps you going in this field?
It's a hot issue, I think, also within people working in climate. I think it's not something that just affects people who are sort of interested in it. I think everyone is really overwhelmed by all the information that's coming out there. I would say maybe first is to control the information that comes to you. I don't think you need to read through or take in everything that's sort of shown to you. I think intentionality in terms of finding spaces or times where you feel refreshed and where you feel that you can actually take the time to learn about climate, I think is really important, because nothing good comes out of people being overwhelmed and being overwhelmed to the point where they don't learn or where they can't take action. I think the second is that climate will lead to a lot of loss. I think just accepting that from the starting point, I think, is both sad but also true. I think it'll lead to the loss of biodiversity. I think it'll lead to the loss of livelihoods. I think it'll lead to change, which is really, really scary. But I think if you flip that on the side, and I think this is what really keeps me going, I think it's also this phenomenal opportunity to radically change how society is, to radically rechange how human civilization is, to radically change how our culture operates. So you have this huge issue that is promising to upend our daily lives, upend the lives of our kids and our kids' kids. In a lot of moments of really intense change where human civilization is facing down something that's changing all parts of the world, you also have societies that become completely transformed. You have a rebuilding of sorts. And I think climate offers this really cool once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rebuild the very foundation of civilization. So what I mean by that is maybe we don't have to build against nature. Maybe we can build with it. Maybe the way that we interact and talk about the regions that we're from change. Maybe we know more of the plants and animals that live near us. Maybe we are able to better describe what Earth is and what it means to us. Maybe we're able to build systems that don't continuously extract from this really precious Earth that we have. And so I think it's really this opportunity that lies with it, is that you can build something better. And I think this is an opportunity to build something better. I think the flip is there's a lot of really amazing people also working in climate. I think it's brought a lot of new people in. And because it touches every industry, I think there's a part for everyone to play. I don't think you need to be a big climate warrior or, again, know all the scientific details about it. But I think you can do climate work as everyday people. And so I think the people working in climate, the people who care about climate, and the amount of people that have increasingly cared about climate is something that also gives me a lot of hope.
What do you mean by climate work for everyday people?
I think it's really understanding what your actions are doing on a day-to-day basis that are influencing the state of the Earth or the climate of the Earth. So what that could mean is maybe you have a proposition that gets passed locally that impacts sort of how recycling is done or impacts banning gas sort of stovetops. And I think climate work in that sense would be you being willing to talk to people, your friends, and support it and ensure that those sort of propositions pass. It could mean you volunteering. It could mean you protesting. It could even mean you working in the industry or pushing for greater sustainability or net zero goals within your corporation. I think there's a lot of ways you could go about it, but I think to me, it's any work that pushes forward this idea of climate change is here and it is an existential threat, but there's also an opportunity to really work towards transforming society for the better of it.
Can you share a little bit more about what you're going to be working on for the next few months?
Yeah, so at the end of this summer, I'll be starting at Probable Futures, which I sort of alluded to earlier, which is this really great climate literacy, climate data organization that is trying to make climate understandable for everyone everywhere. And as part of the organization, I'm going to be the director of Climate Adaptation Strategy. And what that really means in essence is that I'm hoping to really push forward and build a better understanding of how cities, how people, how governments can really start to think about climate adaptation at the levels that they are and start to really implement standards or policies or just have even stories for them to start to grasp the topic. Because I think it is, as you were saying earlier, this really big, scary, theoretical topic that I think people just don't know how to even approach to begin with. So I think I'll be working on that, and we'll be working on that through the year.
Can you name a country or jurisdiction that you feel like is doing really well in handling climate adaptation?
So I don't have the answer off the top of my head. I think it's hard to pinpoint a country because I think so much of the work and push climate adaptation wise has been at a sort of more regional scale. I think where you see actually the coolest climate adaptation work happening is also from some of the greatest tragedies. So from California wildfires, you have cities that are now increasingly focused on climate adaptation and what they can do to prevent and adapt to another wildfire if it hits because of this one that happened. I think you have countries in South Asia who have been hit with immense heat waves, who have now set up whole systems to ensure that people have places where they can cool down and where they know what to do in case another heat wave occurs. And so I think you have places that are really affected by climate and are increasingly being affected by climate already really thinking through climate adaptation. I think at a global level, it's still something that's really underlooked. And especially in comparison to topics such as mitigation, which is this idea that I think we hear about a lot, which is decarbonization, electrifying everything, electric cars, which is really important. Don't get me wrong. I think you have a lot of push towards mitigation, and a lot of cities and countries are really focused on pushing that forward. But I think they forget that climate change is already here and will continue to be here. And that means that the earth and people will continue to be impacted by climate. And so adaptation also needs to happen side by side.
Actually, can you break that down? So you mentioned there's climate mitigation and then there's climate adaptation. Is there another category that's out there, or is it just between the two?
I think it's mainly those two
Okay.
is how a lot of work is centered right now. So climate mitigation is, again, the idea that you're trying to reduce carbon emissions. So this is fossil fuels, oil, gas, all of that, to hopefully zero. And that's where the term net zero comes in a lot, which is how can you get to a place where there is no accumulation of carbon going into the atmosphere? It's really important because climate mitigation basically helps us prevent the worst of climate change. But if you stopped polluting today, any carbon, say every factory shut down, every car that drove with oil was suddenly banned, there was no more carbon going into the atmosphere, you would still have the earth warm for another couple decades because so much carbon has accumulated in the atmosphere that takes such a long time to break down that even if we stop today, climate change will continue because the earth also lags in its response back to homeostasis. And so climate adaptation then is this idea that you need to adapt to climate change that's happening now. So that includes sea level rise, frequent and more intense storms and extreme weather that might be happening, and other sorts of changes that are caused by just our changing climate systems, changes in the ocean, changes in the atmosphere.
Final question. I understand that you want to have kids, and kids have kind of come up as like a clickbaity, sensationalized way to reduce your carbon. There have been debates about whether or not people should even continue having children, given the way the world is today. I've had friends whose partners have told them, I don't want to have kids because of the climate impacts. And that's it. Like, there are no other reasons because that reason to them is legitimate enough.
I think there's an element where if you decide to bring life on Earth, you have to be okay with what the future holds, and you have to be okay with all the versions of what you think the future could hold. The really nice one where we manage to fix everything, where everything is mitigated and we adapt and we're able to figure it out. And the really terrible one where we don't, and millions or billions of people's lives are forever changed. I think for every person, I think you just have to figure out what that means to you and whether you would be okay with that future and all those possibilities of those futures. I think for me, there's a lot of personal elements as part of it. But I think ultimately relating to climate, kids also are this really powerful way for you to shape the future. I think by raising kids who are cognizant of climate, who care about it, who are stewards of the earth, I think I also hope that my legacy will be a continuation of a lot of those ideals and hopefully impact that will continue beyond me as well.
Amazing. Thank you for your time, Nabig.
Thank you for having me.
What's your favorite hike?
My favorite hike? Anywhere?
Anywhere.
Favorite hike? Oof, that's such a tough question.
Your top 10 hikes. Any of the top 10.
You're like, any will do. It doesn't have to be anything.
Your top 100 hikes. How many times have you hiked, Nabig?
Oh my God, there's just so many. Okay, maybe I'll share a recent one.
Okay.
Maybe you can say a recent hike that you've liked.